or outside critics, but everything to do with its own rise in global authority. On the surface, Jehovah's Witnesses appear gentle, steady, predictable. You notice them walking in pairs through calm neighborhoods, dressed neatly, greeting strangers with polite smiles. Their conversations carry no urgency, no noise, no alarm, just a steady message they've repeated for decades. But behind this soft exterior lies an intricate machine, one that stretches across continents. It reaches into remote villages, crowded cities, isolated islands, and towering financial districts. It is a movement built on order, discipline, and control so effective that outsiders often underestimate the structure shaping it from within. Inside kingdom halls, families settle into silence as meetings begin. There is a sense of routine here, words spoken in a familiar rhythm, lessons repeated with unwavering precision. Nothing feels out of place. And yet, if you spent long enough observing, you might catch subtle hints that something deeper is stirring. An older member pausing longer than usual before answering a question. A whisper between two elders that carries more tension than the polite tone suggests. A sudden change in an announcement. A rule presented with sharper certainty. These tiny signals, barely noticeable, are like cracks forming in a polished stone. Not enough to break it, not enough to draw attention, but enough to raise quiet questions in the minds of those who stand close enough to feel the shift. Behind this calm public image stands a vast administrative tower, figuratively and literally. At its center is the organization's headquarters in New York, a building that feels more like the nerve center of a multinational body than a simple religious office. From these upper floors, decisions ripple outward into every congregation on earth. Policies crafted in secluded rooms shape the lives of millions. Instructions written by unseen committees reach elders who deliver them without alteration. For a faith built on the idea of spiritual equality, this level of central control creates a pressure that is rarely discussed openly. Yet this is not a new phenomenon. The struggle between spiritual ideals and organizational authority has existed since the earliest days of this movement. Over time, leadership styles changed, teaching methods shifted, and the faces at the top rotated. But the underlying question, who truly guides the direction of this faith, never entirely faded. It simply moved from one era to the next, resting in the hands of different figures, prophetic voices, presidential rulers, and eventually invisible operators who influence the structure from behind locked doors. Today, that tug-of-war has reached its most complex stage. On one side stands a growing leadership structure, firm, coordinated, international. On the other side stand members across the globe whose expectations remain tied to the early story, a small group of Bible students seeking clarity, truth, and the promise of a better world. As global authority expands, the space between those two worlds becomes harder to ignore. Many members feel this tension without being able to name it. They sense the shift in tone, the tightening of rules, the steady rise in formality. Instructional videos replace open discussions. Elder letters arrive more frequently. Meetings focus heavily on loyalty. Questions that once felt harmless now carry weight. A quiet expectation grows. Obey instantly, trust fully, speak cautiously. Because behind every rule stands a chain of command that reaches far beyond the walls of a local hall. This structure has grown so large that it almost resembles a small nation, one without borders, armies, or elections, yet with clear leadership and enforced loyalty. It moves slowly, confidently, always projecting steadiness. But even the most stable system can feel pressure when its power becomes too concentrated or when its narrative stretches beyond what members can hold without strain. Imagine standing inside a crowded kingdom hall. The opening prayer has ended, and an elder steps onto the stage. His tone is gentle, but behind his words is a firm message from far above him. He speaks not only as a local figure, but also as a conduit for a much larger mind. Each phrase he delivers is shaped by someone he has never met. Each instruction he shares originated from a distant table where a small group decided what millions should believe, how they should behave, and what choices they should avoid. Some accept this without question. Others feel something tightening around them, like a rope being pulled from both ends. They understand the importance of unity, yet they notice how unity is slowly changing into uniformity. And when uniformity becomes the expectation, the slightest difference begins to feel dangerous. This documentary begins at this crossroads, where faith meets authority, where belief meets control, and where devotion meets the slow rise of institutional power. Here, three forces stand at the heart of the tension. Prophets, the early voices whose interpretations shaped the foundation. Presidents, the men who turned a small study group into a global structure. Power brokers, modern figures whose influence is vast yet largely unseen. Together, these forces form a triad that defines the story of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Their teachings are not shaped by a single mind but by the layered impact of these eras: prophetic beginnings, presidential authority, and the current expansion of global leadership. But to understand how this pressure formed, we cannot begin with today's leaders. We must return to a time before the global offices, before the legal departments, before the carefully crafted broadcasts. We must step backward into the world of a young man searching for answers, a man whose questions quietly planted the seeds of a movement that would one day circle the earth. And so, before the machinery of leadership existed, before the structure hardened into what it is now, there stood a single figure, an idealist, a seeker, a voice that believed certainty could be found in ancient texts. His story begins not in a boardroom but in a simple room above a shop, surrounded by worn books and flickering lamps, where a small group gathered with open pages and restless minds. The story goes back to the late 1800s, when factories were the most common thing on the skyline and horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with the first streetcars. The United States was growing quickly, but with that growth came uncertainty. People were doubting everything: their faith, their money, their future, and their place in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. There was a young man named Charles Taze Russell walking through this restless landscape. He was carrying doubts that he tried to hide behind calm eyes. He grew up in a place where people talked about religious ideas with complete confidence, but those ideas never really fit with him. Every sermon he heard made him ask more questions than it answered, and every warning about eternal punishment made something in his chest tighten that he couldn't ignore. Russell walked around bookstores looking for clues, flipping through old books on theology, history, and biblical commentary. He heard pastors argue with each other in crowded halls where the air smelled like sweat and smoke. He got more and more confused the more he listened. Even though the preachers around him spoke loudly and with confidence, nothing felt real. He was afraid of getting stuck in beliefs that didn't match what he read on his own. He wondered if he was looking for answers that weren't there, but something deeper kept him going. His search wasn't driven by rebellion. It was driven by a need to understand a God he thought had to be more consistent than the versions he heard preached from pulpits. One night, after leaving a sermon that was too strict for his taste, Russell was drawn to a small group inside a small building that was talking about the Bible. There were open books and handwritten notes all over the wooden table in the warm room. The conversation was gentle compared to the heated debates he had heard elsewhere. They were asking questions not to be rude, but to learn. He joined them reluctantly, expecting them to fight back, but instead he found that they were interested. He felt like he could ask questions without being afraid for the first time. That little moment was the start of something that neither he nor anyone else in the room could have seen coming. He became a key voice in that group over time. His insights were calm but sure, and his observations were based on careful reading rather than big claims. People liked how clearly he explained parts that other people had missed or misunderstood. People talked about it quietly, and soon the group grew. Meetings moved from small rooms above stores to slightly bigger ones where people stayed up late comparing translations, taking notes by lamplight, and putting ideas together piece by piece. Russell wasn't trying to start a movement, he was trying to get people to understand. But people around him started to look to him for guidance. As he gained more power, people began to depend on his interpretations more and more. He had a way of putting together timelines and historical events that made many people think the world was on the verge of a major change. He connected things that others couldn't see by using complicated Bible verses. These ideas fascinated his early followers, who began to speak of him with an admiration that sat somewhere between respect and awe. He didn't call himself a prophet, but his predictions carried a weight that made him sound like one. He published his thoughts in small magazines that reached homes far beyond his immediate circle. Letters arrived from distant towns, some praising his work, others filled with questions about life, fear, hope, and the mysteries embedded in Scripture. With each new subscriber, the movement slowly shifted from a local study group into something larger. People began meeting in their own towns, using his writings as a guide. These gatherings created the first footprints of a future global network. Across these early years, the tone remained simple and sincere, but the structure around Russell was becoming more defined. Without intending to, he had started shaping a framework. Followers waited for each new issue of his magazine as if it carried direction for the coming season. Donations began arriving to support printing costs. People who volunteered said they would help pass out literature. Even though no one fully understood it at the time, the first outlines of a system that needed organization, oversight, and leadership started to show up. As the movement grew, it became more and more dependent on Russell. His voice led conversations, shaped how people understood things, and changed what they expected. As people paid more attention to his predictions about the future, they became more sure that he had more knowledge than other teachers. Some people saw him as a reformer, others as a guide, and a few quietly wondered if he had taken on a role he had never officially claimed. To them, he was more than just a man looking for the truth. He was the one who could explain it. When he went to give lectures, the halls filled up quickly. People listened with a mix of interest and respect. Sometimes newspapers were interested in his ideas, and other times they were skeptical. But no matter what other people thought of him, his followers stayed loyal. They liked how kind and determined he was. They believed him when he said that the Bible wasn't meant to be a puzzle that would confuse people, but a book that could be understood if you studied it the right way. Russell's movement had found a rhythm by the time he was in the later years of his life. There were regular publications, study groups were forming in different states, and things were starting to come together in a planned way. Still, the structure felt flexible, big enough to grow and strong enough to stay together. It was a movement that started with one man's search for the truth, and that search had grown more powerful than he could have imagined. People who followed him wondered what would happen if he didn't stand in the middle anymore when his health started to get worse. Some people thought that his writings would help them even after he died. Others were worried because they thought that his absence would create a space that someone else would eventually fill. They were right. When he died, things started to change. These changes would affect everything the movement would become. The small study groups that used to meet quietly above stores were about to become something much more organized. The next era wouldn't just have a soft guide looking for answers. It would also have a new kind of leadership that came with authority, administrative power, and the weight of responsibility that comes with a growing organization. That change was already on the way, just beyond the end of Russell's time. It would change the movement in ways he never fully saw coming. When Russell died, the movement he had worked on for decades began to change. His followers were truly sad about his death, and their grief echoed through the small halls and private study groups that still taught his lessons. A lot of them had never had another guide. He had been their guide, the voice they trusted when the Bible seemed too hard or too much to handle. And now that he's gone, the organization is quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It's more like a hesitation. In every meeting, the question that no one wanted to say out loud hung in the air. Who is in charge now? The first few weeks after he died felt weak. Members read the same printed pages, went over the same lessons, and met in the same rooms, but there was a quiet sense of uncertainty in their daily lives. The way the leaders were set up had never been meant for this time. There was no official plan or person chosen to take over. Russell had left behind guidelines for understanding prophecy and guidance, but he had not made it clear how to lead a movement that had grown far beyond its beginnings. Joseph Rutherford came into this uncertainty, and his presence did not blend in with the background. Rutherford's past was not like Russell's, which was shaped by quiet reflection. Instead, it was shaped by courtroom battles and strong arguments. He knew how the law worked. He knew how to claim, defend, and use authority with great force. Russell was calm and clear, while Rutherford had the strength of someone who thought he could give orders when no one else was willing to. Russell's confidence set him apart in the months right after he died. Some people found this comforting. For some, it seemed sudden. Rutherford took charge with the conviction of someone who thought the movement needed strong leadership to survive. He took office as president with a level of determination that surprised people who were used to Russell's softer style. But not everyone agreed with how fast or how he made his choices. At first, disagreements were quiet, but they got louder as time went on. This was especially true among board members who thought the organization should stay true to the founder's cooperative spirit instead of focusing on one person. The fight that broke out in 1917 was one of the most important early turning points in the movement's history. It didn't happen in public places or through open letters. It happened in private meetings behind closed doors. Board members questioned Rutherford's power, saying that he was taking the organization in a direction that it was never meant to go. They thought he was taking too much power too quickly. Rutherford didn't back down. Instead, he came up with a plan. He looked at the legal papers that governed the group. Few people had ever studied them in depth because they thought the movement would always be guided by spiritual consultation and not by business rules. Rutherford looked over these records with the sharpness of someone who knows how to read every line and clause. He found things that showed that the president had much more power than most people thought. Rutherford saw what others thought was a shared effort as a position that gave him the right to change things as he saw fit. The meetings got tense. People raised their voices. There was a lot of urgency in the letters that were sent. There was a split between people who thought the presidency should be a guiding hand and those who thought it was getting too powerful. In the end, Rutherford won. He kept his job by using a mix of legal reasoning and clever moves within the organization. He got rid of directors who disagreed with him and hired new ones who agreed with him. The balance of power changed a lot in a short amount of time. The organization that used to depend on the soft touch of one teacher was now run by a president who thought strong leadership was necessary for survival. With opposition quieted, Rutherford quickly began to reorganize the structure. He made the rules for running the business stricter and made all decisions in one place. The publishing industry became more organized, and the body of literature began to sound more clear and strong. The movement's identity, which used to be shaped by the personal tone of Russell's writing, now had a more authoritative tone. Discussions were replaced by orders. Instead of open exploration, there were instructions. The study circles that used to talk about ideas in an open way now looked to central leadership for clear answers. It didn't happen all at once, but the effects spread quickly. When new rules came out, elders in faraway congregations felt the change. Volunteers saw that the way literature was given out was more formal. The tone of public speeches started to show how the structure was getting tighter. Russell's influence left room for interpretation, but Rutherford's influence gave people certainty through authority. People who had been with the movement since the beginning couldn't help but notice how different things felt. Some people liked the stability that came with having a clearer path. Some people missed the softer, more curious spirit that had been there in the early years. But no matter how people felt, the change was clear. What had begun as a loose group of people looking for something had turned into something much more stable. An institution with a central leader who had a lot of power over all of the organization's branches. This change was the start of a pattern that would last for many years. As the presidency got stronger, people began to expect that all decisions should come from one place at the top. The movement's cultural identity slowly changed from shared study to unified command. This new environment set the stage for a global system that would eventually reach millions of people, making the organization both strong and complicated. Rutherford's strong leadership opened doors that Russell's humble style never meant to. The change didn't get rid of the founders' ideas, but it did change how they were used. Rutherford led the movement to look outward with new confidence. They built systems that could reach countries far beyond the small groups that used to meet in rented rooms. After this internal fight, the groundwork for growth had been laid. The structure now had a clear center, and it was easier for influence to spread from that center. What started as a quiet search for truth was about to become a global movement, supported by a framework that was becoming more organized and would soon go beyond national borders and grow in ways that no early follower could have imagined. After Rutherford's rise, the movement began to grow outward in ways that surprised even those who had been there since the beginning. The changes he made inside the organization didn't just stay in boardrooms or legal documents. They spread out and affected congregations that had once been able to do things more freely. After the uncertainty that came after Russell's death, people felt more sure of themselves. The movement was now ready to go beyond the towns and borders it knew well. It was ready to spread its message to places far away from the quiet rooms where it had first started. The organization saw opportunity in the changing world as it entered a new century full of changing politics, rebuilding nations, and expanding transportation routes. The movement no longer felt like a fragile network of independent study circles now that there was a strong center of leadership. It had a clear, strong, and unmistakably central direction. This new feeling of stability gave things a push. Volunteers who used to only think about small, local projects now had to think about bigger things. They thought that anyone could hear their message. Their books, which used to be printed in small batches, were now being sent all over the country. Congregations started sending members to places they had never been before, sure that the unified structure behind them could help them grow in ways that had never been possible before. Door-to-door preaching, which used to be a simple local practice, became the movement's defining feature. It wasn't just a way to do things, it became their trademark. People with small bags of literature walked into neighborhoods where the people had never heard of the group. They walked through busy market streets, rural farmland, crowded apartment buildings, and dusty roads that led to faraway places. People they talked to might have thought their message was strange, but the volunteers were sure of themselves and knew that talking to people in person was the best way to reach people who were looking for certainty in a world that often felt unpredictable. This method, which was used thousands of times in different areas, was what brought the movement to many communities. People told stories about couples walking for hours, sometimes up steep paths in quiet mountain areas and sometimes through busy transportation routes to get to small homes on the edges of big cities. People were skeptical, curious, and sometimes even hostile toward them, but they kept going and made an impression. The movement slowly began to spread to places that were not only far away, but also different in culture, language, and tradition. The organization needed a lot more than just the simple publications of the past to support this growing work. What started as a small printing job quickly turned into a huge project. Big buildings were built where presses ran all day and night, making books in amounts that Russell could never have imagined. People worked at long tables, folding magazines, stacking books, and loading crates that were going to faraway places. The sound of machines became a part of the daily rhythm of the movement's growth. Each printed page had ideas that came from rooms far away from the people who would read them. There were more and more translations. There were only a few languages at first, but the list quickly grew. Soon, people all over the world were getting ready to read magazines and books. Volunteers who were good at languages worked hard to make sure that the message stayed the same no matter where it was sent. It was very important that the words were the same. Leadership wanted the same ideas to get to people in a village in Africa as they did to people reading in a city in Europe or a coastal town in South America. In the early days of the movement, this level of coordination was unheard of. Now, though, it was necessary. The growth also needed physical hubs. There were branch offices in different countries, and they were all linked to the main office. These branches were in charge of running things and making sure everything ran smoothly. They sent out literature, set up preaching efforts, and sent instructions to local congregations. The system became part of a global network, with each part connected to the next and each decision made by the same group of leaders. As this structure grew, the movement's identity became clearer. It was no longer a collection of independent gatherings. It was now a single group with one message, one strategy, and one set of expectations. The growth of the business around the world also brought up problems. In some countries, the government didn't trust the group. People were suspicious of their motives because they preached in a strange way and wouldn't participate in some community events. In some places, the movement's teachings went against cultural norms, which made things difficult for local members. Every new country brought its own problems, and even though headquarters tried to help, things on the ground could be much more complicated. But the group kept going, thanks to a leadership structure that thought growth was both possible and necessary. The movement spread from the Americas to Africa, Europe to Asia, and from islands in the oceans to the center of big cities. Every new congregation made the global body heavier, which made it more powerful but also made it need to be more strictly coordinated. As the movement grew, so did people's hopes for its timeline, its teachings, and its view of what would happen in the future. As more people joined, the leaders had to work harder to keep things stable. Every country added to the promise of a coming change, which had been part of the movement since Russell's early explanations. Now, that hope was no longer limited to a small group of people in a room above a store. It echoed across borders, carried by volunteers going door to door, and repeated in meeting halls on far-off shores. This growing global network, which was tightly linked and heavily coordinated, was turning into a system that early Bible students could never have imagined. As the movement spread to new areas, its predictions, teachings, and ideas became more important. Millions of followers were watching, and they thought that the timeline they had been taught would soon line up with events around the world in ways that would change everything. As those expectations got louder, the pressure on leaders grew with them. This set the stage for a time when predictions would shape not only belief but also the future of the whole movement as the movement spread to other continents. Its message included more than just teachings and books. It had timelines. People were excited in the meeting rooms and the living rooms where families studied quietly after long days at work. People thought they were living in a time that would change everything. This expectation wasn't loud or aggressive. It was hopeful, steady, and very comforting for many. The belief that human history was on the verge of a significant transformation provided motivation for the sacrifices made during preaching and the extensive hours dedicated to preparation for each assembly. But as these hopes spread from one country to the next, they grew stronger. Every new group of people who joined brought new hearts that thought the world's clock was about to strike a decisive hour. The strongest and earliest of these hopes were focused on the year 1914. Russell had pointed to this year through his interpretations of Scripture, which combined historical patterns and religious texts in ways that his followers found interesting. As the date got closer, a lot of people felt like they were about to have a promised moment. Some people thought that big changes were about to happen in the world. Others thought that a spiritual change would happen, one that would answer questions that had been bothering them for a long time. When the year came and things didn't go as planned, the emotional effects were complicated. The movement didn't fall apart all at once, but something small changed inside it. People kept studying, gathering, and preaching, but the moment had passed, and they had to change their understanding to fit the new reality they were in. In the years that followed, people started to pay more attention to new dates. People started to talk and write about the years 1918 and 1925 more. As these years drew near, the feeling of anticipation was reignited. Families sat around small kitchen tables and talked quietly about what would happen next. During their long days of preaching, volunteers whispered about what might happen next. People began to believe that the world was heading towards something important. When these years came and the event that was supposed to happen didn't happen, both members and leaders were disappointed. People tried to balance their hopes with the need to keep living their lives. They made changes to their explanations. But these missed opportunities made people more aware that things wouldn't always go as planned. As the years went by, another wave of excitement came, this time bigger than any before. The movement grew in size, reach, influence, and confidence as it grew. By the time the 1970s came around, the group had grown into a global one, and meetings were full of people who thought they were living in important times. Conversations, talks, and written materials all helped people feel that the mid-1970s had a special meaning. A lot of people thought that the world was moving towards something that would fit with what had happened before. Some members sold property without telling anyone. Some people didn't want to make long-term commitments. Young people put off school because they thought a different kind of future was coming soon. The emotional toll was heavy when the expected moment came and went without a clear sign. It wasn't a big, dramatic fall. It was a quiet, private pain. Families sat together and tried to figure out what had happened. Some people were confused after planning so much of their lives around a date that was coming up. Parents who had taught their kids to be urgent now had to answer questions they didn't know how to. Elders tried to help, but they were also dealing with their own feelings. The mood was low-key in many countries. People still went to meetings and helped each other, but the mood had changed. There was still hope, but the certainty that came with certain years didn't feel as strong anymore. There were many personal experiences behind these big dates. One family may have put off moving to a safer area because they thought they didn't have much time. Another person might have decided not to go to school or start a business. In some homes, older people thought about the choices they had made in life that were influenced by these expectations and wondered how things would have turned out if they had made different plans. These stories weren't very dramatic. There were no headlines or public outcries. But the emotional weight that people carried was real. Their sacrifices were real and based on faith, not pressure, but the result was not what they had hoped for. The leaders changed the way they spoke and understood things in response to these times. Ideas were presented with a new emphasis, focusing on the idea that understanding grows over time. People were told to see earlier expectations as honest attempts to understand Scripture rather than certain predictions. This change helped a lot of people keep going without losing their faith. But the feelings stayed with them. The movement didn't break apart, but small questions started to settle in the corners of people's minds. These were questions that people didn't often say out loud but still felt. The movement kept publishing, preaching, and growing over the years. New churches opened, and volunteers kept going to places they had never been before. New teaching cycles started, with less emphasis on specific years and more on general readiness. But the past expectations didn't go away. It stayed in the collective memory, affecting how future generations understood the leadership's advice and how they handled their own feelings of anticipation. These missed moments caused a quiet tension that was felt more than it was talked about all over the world. It didn't break loyalty, but it did make people aware that earlier interpretations didn't always match what happened. This made some people want to learn more. For some, it caused them to doubt themselves. For a lot of people, it taught them how to be patient. It made the leaders need more structured guidance, which would soon come from a group of men who thought they were in charge of making the movement's spiritual direction clearer. That change was already happening. As the timelines of prophecies became less clear, a new kind of leadership took their place. This leadership demanded clear instruction, strong authority, and a clear way to understand the Bible. Years of centralization had already laid the groundwork. Now, it would be shaped into something much more clear, something that would change the movement's internal landscape for generations to come. After the deadlines were missed, the mood inside the movement began to change in ways that were hard to notice at first, but then became clear. People all over the world kept meeting in their halls, listening to familiar teachings, singing the same songs, and doing work they thought was very important. But deep down, everyone wanted stability, something that could bring back a sense of direction after years of changing expectations. The leaders knew this was necessary. The world was changing quickly, and the movement was growing faster than any one person could handle. Something that was more organized, more coordinated, and more powerful was coming together. The presidency, which used to be the main source of guidance, didn't have the same power anymore. The time of one person at the top was coming to an end, not because it had failed, but because the organization had grown too big for one person to manage. The system that had relied on one voice now needed a different kind of leadership, one that could work as a group instead of as a single person. This change started quietly inside the headquarters. Committees were set up to take care of different parts of the growing global work. Meetings that used to be about what the president wanted to do started to be about making decisions as a group. As the restructuring went on, a small group formed. This group would soon be known all over the world as the governing body. There were no big announcements or fanfare when it was first introduced. It grew slowly, almost on its own, as people shared responsibilities and made decisions together. Not many people outside of the headquarters thought about this group in the beginning. People saw them as just administrative overseers who were helping with the growing needs of a global movement. But over time, they had more and more power. There were now several men whose power would increasingly shape the direction of the whole organization, instead of just the president making decisions. The president's role became less important as the governing body got stronger. More and more publications started to mention the group, which made it hard for members to ignore. The tone of the advice changed. Instead of one person giving orders, a group voice did, and it expected everyone to agree with the decisions. The group didn't act like it was far away or out of reach, but it was clear that it was in charge. Over time, people learned that its advice was the source of doctrine, instruction, and organizational direction. This change made things work differently. Elders in the area who used to ask presidents for advice now waited for letters and instructions that showed what the governing body had decided. The system started to work in a way that was very consistent. A letter from the headquarters could change the routines of thousands of congregations in a matter of hours. Members quickly changed their schedules, assignments, and practices to fit in with each other. It was a level of coordination that few religious groups had ever reached. The governing body became more and more visible to regular members. People read about them in newspapers, heard their talks on tape, and later on the radio. Families would gather around screens to watch their guidance, which often included phrases that stressed loyalty and trust. Seeing these men talk brought comfort to some families. For some, it made them realize how much the leadership had changed since the small Bible study groups that used to meet in small rooms. No matter how people felt, this group had an impact on the lives of its members every day. The global network started to work together in a way that made the movement look almost seamless. Instructions sent from one part of the world were quickly followed in another. Branch offices followed orders to the letter. Elders made decisions and followed through on them. People learned the same things no matter where they lived. The governing body carefully shaped the structure of the organization so that it became a single body moving in perfect rhythm. But this growing unity also put pressure on people. With a central authority, people expected everyone to agree with it. Changes in teachings were seen as changes that members were expected to make right away. People often relied on advice from above when making decisions about their own behavior, family matters, moral issues, and even what to do every day. Many people believed this without question, thinking that a unified direction made the movement stronger. Some people, on the other hand, felt the heavy weight of rules that seemed to intrude on parts of their lives that they thought were private. People inside the organization didn't talk about this tension, but they felt it. People who had grown up during times when timelines changed had learned how to deal with changes in their understanding. Now, they had to get used to a structure that required them to always trust each other. There was no yelling or fear to make people do this. It was woven into conversations, talks, and books in a soft but clear way. Trust was a big part of the story. Loyalty became a sign of how strong your spirit was. People took the governing body's words as seriously as they took doctrine. As this structure became more stable, the organization's identity became linked to both its message and its system of power. A lot of people liked how clear it made things. Some people were worried about how far apart the men who led local congregations were from them. The rise of the governing body was a turning point in the movement's growth, whether people saw it as reassuring or demanding. It was a time when leadership became centralized in a way that the movement's early leaders never thought possible. The governing body was not the only group that had power in the organization, though. There was another layer behind them, made up of people who ran the legal, financial, and administrative systems that made this huge global network work. Most of the time, regular members didn't see their decisions, but they had an effect on everything from publishing to court cases to enforcing policies. These people didn't speak on stage or write for magazines, but their influence was clear. Inside the organization's headquarters, far from the halls where members met every week, there was another world that few people outside of it ever really saw. The governing body was the spiritual leader of the movement, but there were other people who had a lot of power behind the scenes. These men didn't give speeches or perform on stage. They were editors, strategists, administrators, legal experts, and financial overseers whose names rarely came up outside of the places where they worked. They didn't have spiritual roles, but their choices affected almost every part of the world's structure. The offices where these people worked didn't have the same feel as kingdom halls. There were no hymns, no public talks, and no readings from the Bible. Long hallways with filing rooms and offices on either side made it feel like there was a controlled silence instead. In those rooms, people looked over piles of papers, letters from all over the world, and made decisions that would affect congregations on other continents. Advisors would sit at big tables full of reports from branch offices on a normal day. These reports were about legal problems, property problems, policy questions, and problems with the organization. They rarely talked about what was going on outside the room, but the results spread all over the world. Lawyers were some of the most important people in this secret world. They looked at laws in other countries, read court decisions, and looked over letters from the government. When a church had a problem, like a land dispute or a question about local laws, these advisors helped the church figure out how to respond. Their interpretations determined the approach of elders to sensitive situations, the organization's legal defense strategies, and the permissible limits of specific policies to avoid legal repercussions. Their choices weren't published, but they changed the tone and direction of the advice that members got. Policy architects collaborated with these advisors. Their job was to figure out what the organization needed and turn those needs into rules that elders all over the world would follow. These internal rules affected how elders dealt with sensitive issues, how meetings were run, and how congregations adjusted to changes. They wrote the instructions that came in sealed envelopes or private letters. A lot of older people read these rules without knowing who wrote them or how many people talked about them before they were written. What seemed easy at first often took months of discussion inside the company. In a different part of the headquarters, editors and translators worked on publications that would be read by millions of people. They did their work carefully and exactly. Each sentence had to match the accepted meanings. Every paragraph had to have a tone that was the same all over the world. Editors made notes on drafts and changed the wording and emphasis. Translators made sure that the message kept its meaning in different languages and cultures. The governing body approved the main points of doctrine, but these teams decided how the material would be presented, what words would be used, and how it would feel. Their choices had a big impact on how people all over the world understood the teachings. At the same time, people in charge of finances managed a lot of money. Their work wasn't spiritual, but it was necessary for the movement to be known around the world. They kept an eye on the money that churches around the world gave and made decisions about how it would be spent. They bought land, built buildings, sold property, and helped run big businesses. They had a lot of say over the organization's physical shape, such as where to build branch offices, which halls needed work, and which areas needed more help. Their decisions affected the lives of local congregations, even though most members didn't know their names. These roles, legal, policy, editorial, and financial, worked together like gears in a machine. Every choice had an effect on the others. A legal issue in one country could cause policies to change all over the world. A change in the tone of the editorial could change how elders spoke from the platform. A lack of money could slow down the growth. Even though these men didn't have any public titles, they had a huge impact on the lives of millions of people. They were the people who ran a complicated system that needed to be tightly coordinated. It wasn't just encouraged to keep things private in these offices, it was the rule. Some papers had markings on them that made it hard for some people to read them. Only people whose jobs required them to be there were allowed to go to meetings. Letters that summarized decisions without going into detail about the discussions behind them were sent to branch offices. Elders used rules without ever understanding the reasons behind them. Members heard simplified explanations that didn't often hint at the processes that made them. This separation made an invisible line between the public life of the congregation and the organization's deeper workings. As the movement grew, the difference between how it looked to the public and how it worked inside got bigger. Members often thought the organization was simple, united, and consistent. But behind that simple facade was a complicated web of committees, advisors, and strategists who made decisions that had nothing to do with the daily life of a typical church. The volunteers who went door to door handing out literature had no reason to think about how much support their work had from the inside. They saw the message, not the device. They felt the connection, not the friction. They followed the teachings without knowing about the arguments and changes that took place behind closed doors. When world events forced the organization to change, the hidden operators had the most power. A court decision in one country could lead to a policy change that affected older people on the other side of the world. A legal issue that is still being worked out could change how churches deal with sensitive issues. Conversations in conference rooms led to decisions that would later be made known in meeting halls through short announcements or small changes to literature. Members often thought these changes were small, but they came about after a lot of internal discussion by people who didn't often show up in public. As the organization got bigger, the burden of these hidden roles got heavier. Their choices had a big impact on the movement's tone, direction, and identity. They stood behind the rules that elders enforced, the messages that members heard, and the global strategies that were used to deal with new problems. They made up a layer of influence that worked quietly but strongly, always being there, always doing something, and always changing the structure below the surface. But these internal forces did more than just run things. They also had a hand in making some of the movement's most controversial policies, which affected the personal lives of members and had effects that went beyond administrative issues. These rules would soon have an effect not only in meeting halls but also in hospitals, courtrooms, and homes around the world. These policies, which were made with a mix of spiritual guidance and secret strategy, would show what happened next in the complicated story of the movement. As the group grew and its internal workings became more complicated, some of its rules started to have effects on members' lives that few people outside the group could fully understand. These policies didn't come from loud speeches or big announcements. They took shape quietly through letters from headquarters, changes to the literature, and instructions given to elders. Over time, they became a normal part of congregational life. Of these, the long-standing stance on blood had the most personal significance and the most lasting effect. For a lot of members, the policy wasn't just a rule. It became a test of loyalty that went far beyond meeting rooms. Parents told their kids from a young age that they couldn't get certain medical treatments that involved blood. This understanding shaped how people talked about emergency care, injuries, and surgeries. The policy made people feel like they were being watched in homes where faith was a big part of family life. This meant that when things got really bad and fear and urgency took over, members had to make decisions that people outside the group often found hard to understand. These things happened in hospitals all over the world. In the emergency room, doctors had to deal with kids with serious injuries, adults in critical condition, and elderly patients who needed a blood transfusion right away to stay alive. During many of these times, medical staff were confused when families turned down treatment that could have saved a life. The families did not make the decision because they didn't trust medicine. It was about sticking to a belief that had been taught as an unbreakable rule. Doctors thought it was medically necessary, but families thought it was spiritually necessary. This difference in how they saw things made things very stressful when they had to make decisions quickly. Elders often helped families get through these tough times. They went to hospital rooms, talked quietly to worried family members, and reminded them of what they thought was expected. Some people found comfort in their presence, but others felt the weight of the choice even more. These talks weren't mean or uncaring. They came from a strong sense of duty to uphold teachings that had been passed down through the years. But the effect on the members was very strong. Parents held their shaking hands in hospital hallways, spouses fought with fear and guilt, and children grew up hearing stories of families who had been through the same things. The group's position on politics also affected the lives of people all over the world. In countries where politics affected jobs, schools, and social acceptance, staying neutral had effects. Members didn't vote, didn't join political groups, and didn't take on roles that required them to take part in civic decisions. In some countries, this lack of participation made things confusing for neighbors. In some cases, it made people suspicious or even angry. Members had to explain their position over and over again to coworkers, classmates, and sometimes even government officials who wanted to know what they were up to. People were taught that this kind of neutrality was a way to be loyal and stay out of the conflicts that were going on in public life. Many members agreed to this separation because they thought it would help them keep their spiritual clarity. Others, especially in places where being politically active was a big part of the culture, had a hard time with how lonely it made them feel. In workplaces where political events affected relationships, people sometimes ended up standing apart from their coworkers without meaning to. The policy didn't stop them from caring about their community, but it did limit how much they could do to help. Organizational expectations also had an effect on decisions about education. It was never against the law for members to go to school, but they were often told not to go to college and to live simple lives focused on ministry. A lot of young people didn't go to college because they thought it would take them away from their spiritual duties. Some people became adults with few options and took jobs that gave them stability but didn't allow them to move up. Years later, a lot of people thought about the paths they could have taken and how their lives might have turned out if education had been seen differently. People who stayed in the movement often saw these sacrifices as signs of loyalty. But for some, the rules caused problems within themselves, especially when their skills or interests led them to fields that needed more training. Parents who really believed in the advice from headquarters often cut off conversations about college before they even started. Young adults tried to carefully balance their goals with the expectations that put service and simplicity above personal success. The consequences of these policies extended beyond individual decisions. They had an impact on families, jobs, friendships, and the paths of people's lives. In many countries, members had to deal with the results of choices made years ago. These choices weren't based on what the person wanted, but on how they understood their own guidance. These decisions were made with good intentions, but they had effects that lasted for a long time and affected almost every area of life. These policies were not only based on what the governing body taught, but also on what the power brokers mentioned earlier had to say. Legal advisors thought about what might happen if policies were changed. The administrative teams thought about how to put the guidance into action around the world. Editors decided how the literature that sent these messages would sound. People in charge of finances made sure that resources were in line with these goals. The last policy that members agreed on was the result of many levels of decision-making that were made by people whose names didn't often come up in public. These hidden factors helped explain why some policies seemed stricter than others. Legal issues affected how the rules were worded. Cultural issues affected how much they were stressed in some areas. Sometimes, branch offices asked for clarification when a new instruction caused confusion in their area. When families had problems that didn't fit neatly into the rules, elders called headquarters for help. The internal machinery responded, sometimes with new letters, sometimes with reminders of old rules, and sometimes with small changes that only careful readers would notice. These policies were not just about doctrine. They became very important to the movement's identity, showing loyalty and belonging. Members used these expectations to judge how committed each other was. Families taught them as part of their moral code. Elders enforced them with a seriousness they thought was needed to keep everyone together. The organization, which was shaped by many different factors, thought these rules were necessary to keep the movement separate from the outside world. Even though the policies were the same everywhere, the effects were very personal. Hospital rooms, classrooms, workplaces, and government offices became places where people had to deal with the effects of decisions made far away. Some people felt stronger after these moments. Some people felt stressed. All of them knew that spiritual guidance came with responsibilities that touched on the most sensitive parts of life. As these rules changed how people lived their lives every day, a different system was growing within congregations. The internal disciplinary structure. This system was quieter but just as important. It was a way to keep everyone together, but for many, it added a new level of stress that went beyond any written rule. Policies that affected medical decisions, education, and everyday choices were just one part of what members went through. There was another system below these rules that was quieter, more private, and much more personal. It was a system meant to bring people together, but it had an emotional weight that many people felt long before they ever talked about it. This system worked through the elders, who were the men in charge of each congregation, and it was based on a strict form of discipline that most people outside the movement didn't fully understand. Most members saw elders as caring people, neighbors who came over when someone was sick, friends who gave advice, men who prayed at hospital bedsides, and people who listened when someone was going through a hard time. They often made people feel better just by being there. But one of their duties required them to be firm. When it was thought that a member had gone against the movement's rules, a private process began. This process took place in a smaller room, not the open hall, where conversations had serious consequences. Elders, not members, asked for these meetings. They were quiet and often set up after a service or a short talk in the hallway. The tone was calm, almost soft, but the reason for the invitation was important. 3 older people usually sat across from the person in that private room. There were no loud voices or dramatic displays in the setting, but the mood was very serious. The elders asked questions about behavior, choices, and personal issues that people didn't often talk about. It felt like stepping into a place where every word meant something for the person sitting across from them. These talks weren't meant to be mean. The elders thought they were keeping the congregation safe, keeping moral clarity, and helping the person get back on what they thought was a better path. But for the person being questioned, it could feel very vulnerable. Some people were relieved and thankful for the help. Others felt overwhelmed and didn't know how much to say or how their answers would affect their standing in the community they depended on. For many people, the fear wasn't about the conversation itself, but about what might happen afterward. If the elders thought someone was truly sorry, the issue usually ended with private advice. But if they thought the person hadn't shown enough remorse, the consequences could be very bad. Excommunication, which members called being kicked out of the church, was not announced in a dramatic way. The message was given from the platform in a simple way, usually at the end of a meeting, and no details were given. The announcement was over in less than a minute. The effects lasted much longer. As soon as the announcement was made, the person went through a big change. People who had eaten with them before no longer said hello. People who had been friends with them for years moved aside. No one answered the phone. In some families, even close relatives followed the rules strictly and only talked about important things. There was no loud or public silence after the announcement. It was quiet, cold, and complete. Every part of their daily life changed for the person who went through it. It felt different to go to the store. The hall felt different when I walked in. Even seeing a familiar face in a parking lot made me feel like there was a new distance between us. They taught this practice as a way to protect the moral integrity of the congregation. Elders stressed that it took time, thought, and proof of change to bring someone back to life. They thought that this silence had a purpose, to strengthen the boundaries that they thought were necessary for unity. But for those who went through it, the emotional toll could be huge. Parents saw their kids leave them in meeting rooms. Siblings walked by each other without saying a word. Friends who used to laugh together didn't look at each other. In a lot of cases, the person who was going to be excommunicated had to deal with not only spiritual uncertainty but also a deep sense of loss. Excommunication didn't always start the silence. Before there was an official announcement, some people felt like they had to limit their conversations or keep their personal thoughts to themselves. People who asked questions about how things were done or how decisions were made were not always welcome, and people who did were sometimes seen with suspicion. Even though no one said them out loud, everyone knew what was and wasn't okay to talk about. Members learned to choose their words carefully, especially around older people. They didn't do it out of fear. They did it because they knew that some topics had consequences. This setting didn't lead to big fights. Instead, it made a quiet tension that hung over the life of the congregation. At family gatherings, people stayed away from some conversations. Young people were afraid to tell their friends what they thought if it wasn't what they were supposed to think. There were no threats to keep people in line. Instead, there were subtle cues, shared stories, and the constant knowledge of what could happen if someone went too far outside the rules. These internal dynamics affected daily life in a big way. Someone who had doubts often fought with them alone because they didn't want to bother others or draw attention to themselves. If someone is having trouble making decisions, they might not want to ask for help because they are afraid that being honest could get them in trouble. Families who wanted to help their loved ones who were facing consequences had to find a balance between being kind and following rules that made certain kinds of contact less likely. People didn't often talk about these tensions, but they changed how people felt in congregations all over the world. Even though it was hard, many people who went through these things stayed involved with the movement by quietly going to meetings and hoping to be reinstated. They sat in the back rows, often by themselves, waiting for the day when an announcement would bring them back together with their friends and family. This return brought relief to some. For some, it was the end of a long and hard journey. The process showed how serious discipline was and how much commitment was expected from members, no matter what. This system, which was based on order and unity, affected how elders dealt with many different situations, such as personal problems, family fights, and moral choices. The effects went beyond just those who were punished. It changed the way people talked to each other, made expectations stronger, and made it so that silence meant as much as words. People outside of the organization were starting to notice, even though these internal mechanisms were mostly hidden from the public. Governments, courts, and independent groups began to look more closely at what the movement was doing. People started to wonder in places where religious and civic expectations clashed. As the movement grew, the difference between how things were done inside and how they were looked at from the outside grew. The next part of the story began to unfold in this changing space, which was between internal discipline and external reaction. As the movement spread to other continents and the internal discipline system continued to shape the lives of its members, another force began to grow. This force did not come from within the congregation, but from the outside world, which was paying more attention than ever before. For many years, the group had been slowly moving across borders, spreading its teachings, structure, and expectations. But the same systems that made the movement loyal and united were getting more and more attention from governments, courts, and human rights groups that saw things in a different way. Many people outside the group saw what members saw as devotion as a reason to be worried. That difference in point of view slowly turned into a series of global conflicts that would directly test the movement more than anything else it had ever faced. In some places, the first signs of tension appeared quietly. Officials in the area started to ask about how to register and how congregations do things. These questions didn't get a lot of attention at first, but they started a pattern that spread to other areas. Branch offices got letters asking for more information about their roles in the organization, the financial systems, and the way things are done inside. In some areas, it was easy to answer these questions. In some cases, they made it easier for people to look more closely. The most dramatic fight happened in Russia, where a series of court decisions completely changed the movement's landscape. People used to be able to see meetings happen in public, but now they were seen through the harsh light of state suspicion. The court hearings went on, looking at doctrines, analyzing publications, and asking what role discipline should play in congregations. People who had never thought they would be involved in political or legal fights suddenly found themselves facing rules they didn't fully understand. When the final decision came, it shocked families who had been meeting quietly for years. The movement was declared illegal, and properties were seized all over the country. Their meeting places were closed, and their books were taken off the shelves. Parents tried to help their kids deal with the sudden loss of their spiritual home. Elders who used to focus on leading their congregations now had to deal with a world where people were suspicious of them just being there. In other parts of Europe, worries were different. People in a number of countries were interested in how the organization dealt with discipline and family separations. The courts looked into whether cutting off former members put too much emotional pressure on them. There were arguments in parliaments, newsrooms, and the legal community. Members explained their loyalty and desire to stay away from harmful influences, while critics focused on the emotional toll it took on families. The group said that its structure was a matter of religious freedom. Some lawmakers wondered if those freedoms were in conflict with the rights of people who were torn between their beliefs and their personal lives. A full government investigation in Australia added another level of scrutiny. Investigators got information from many different religious and non-religious groups, including the movement. Some families talked about their experiences for the first time in public. The investigation looked at how things worked inside the organization, looked at past cases, and looked at how different groups dealt with sensitive issues. People who were watching from far away said the hearings felt both far away and very personal. They heard people talk about their faith in places that felt very different from the quiet places where they worshipped. The inquiry's results made leaders wonder how the movement would react to increasing pressure from governments that wanted accountability and openness. The way things worked was different in South America, Africa, and some parts of Asia. Some governments were suspicious of the movement because it didn't want to get involved in politics. In countries where being patriotic was expected by law, being neutral caused legal problems. In some areas, members had trouble finding work because employers wanted them to be involved in politics. In schools, children were sometimes questioned about their refusal to participate in state rituals. These tensions didn't always lead to big legal fights, but they affected the daily lives of members who had to deal with social norms that didn't match their beliefs. Pushback looked different in different countries, but a common theme started to show up. The world was watching. Social workers, doctors, judges, and journalists all met members in situations where the rules of their organizations affected their choices. They saw families make medical choices based on their religious beliefs. They heard about people who had been cut off from their families because of internal disciplinary actions. They saw that young people were missing out on some educational opportunities because of what their organizations expected of them. And as more of these stories came out, the arguments about where to draw the line between religious freedom and individual rights got louder. The group worked together more closely in response. Publications started to respond to criticisms in a roundabout way by stressing loyalty and unity. Branch offices got new instructions on how to deal with questions from the authorities. Elders were told to be careful when dealing with sensitive issues. Legal advisors looked over court decisions and changed their plans based on what they learned. These responses weren't loud or aggressive. They were calm, thought out, and meant to keep the movement stable in a world that is getting more complicated. These outside problems put a new kind of stress on many members. They were used to telling their neighbors, classmates, and co-workers what they believed, but it was different to explain legal or political disagreements. Some people didn't talk about them at all because they didn't know how to explain things they didn't fully understand. Others strongly defended the movement, using the information in official documents to back them up. Some people, on the other hand, were quietly thinking about how hard it was to stay true to their faith while being watched by others. In some places, the pushback made members more determined because they saw these problems as a test of faith. In some cases, it brought up questions that had been quietly bothering people for a long time. Families kept going to meetings, preaching, and doing their daily tasks, but they were still aware that the world was watching. It had become a part of the background of church life, an unspoken reminder that the world outside was no longer just watching but also doing something about it. As these pressures built up, a new force began to rise. This force didn't come from governments or courts, it came from technology. It started out slowly, going unnoticed at first, but then it picked up speed and changed how information moved around the world. This new power didn't depend on court decisions or political choices. It used screens, voices, and connections that went around normal barriers and went straight into homes. The organization had been careful about how it looked for decades. It sent its messages through printed pages, recorded talks, and the way people talk to each other in person. The building was made for a time when information moved slowly and people got ideas through face-to-face conversations or carefully read publications. But things were changing in the world. Screens took the place of printed pages. People stopped talking in their living rooms and started talking online. In this new setting, which was not limited by geography and could not be controlled, the movement faced a challenge it had never faced before. The internet made it possible for people to ask questions out loud instead of quietly. People could look for answers, compare points of view, or read stories from people thousands of miles away if they had a phone. For members who didn't have a lot of access to other points of view when they were growing up, the sudden availability of information felt like stepping into a space that was bigger than anything they had ever imagined. Some people were careful about it. Some people were unsure. But once curiosity was piqued, it was hard to ignore. There were conversations about the movement on forums, blogs, and later social media sites. Some were supportive, some were critical, and many were just thinking about it. People who used to be members talked about their own experiences. Reporters wrote about what happened in court. Researchers looked at what was taught. There were videos online with comments from people who had once been in kingdom halls, sharing memories that were emotional, detailed, and sometimes painful. These voices, which used to be alone, now spread quickly over digital networks. Leaders in the movement knew that the internet was becoming more important. They talked about it in talks and publications, stressing the need for caution and telling members to stay away from online spaces where the group was being talked about in a negative way. A lot of families did what they were told, thinking it would keep them safe from bad content. Parents told their kids not to look up information about the movement on the internet. Young people were told to only trust official sources. But in a world where the internet was a part of schoolwork, jobs, and socializing, it was almost impossible to stay away from it completely. As screens became a big part of everyday life, more people saw things they didn't expect to see. Some people found stories from people who talked about their experiences with discipline, being separated from their families, or being confused about their beliefs. Some people found leaked documents, like letters meant for elders, outlines of how things worked inside the organization, and manuals that explained how certain decisions were made behind closed doors. These papers didn't just show up out of nowhere. They came out slowly, shared by people who wanted to show what they thought needed to be seen. The discovery could be unsettling for members who had never thought such materials existed. The information itself and how quickly it spread made this digital shift so important. A single post could reach thousands within hours. Someone in one country could watch a video recorded in another country before the day was over. For the first time, the organization could not control the flow of information. It could respond, explain, or warn, but it couldn't stop the ideas from spreading quickly beyond its control. This new reality caused a quiet current to run through churches. Some members had to deal with questions they had never thought about before. They didn't talk about these questions openly, not because they were scared, but because they weren't sure how other people would react. Some people felt defensive because they thought the online world was too critical. Some people felt torn between being loyal to their religious community and wanting to know more about the stories they saw online. In a lot of homes, late at night, behind closed doors, away from the ears of older people or close friends, people talked about what was true and what was exaggerated. The change hit the young members the hardest. They had grown up in a world where using digital technology was normal. Their schools told them to do research online. Their friends talked to each other through apps and platforms. When they had questions, their first instinct was to look for answers. Some people felt better after reading official sources. Some people found information that didn't match up, which made them uneasy. The organization's caution and the world's openness created a space where young people could quietly shape their own beliefs. Sometimes they agreed with the movement, and other times they drifted away without saying anything. The internet also made it possible for people to form groups that had never existed before. People who had left the movement and thought they were alone found others who had been through the same things. These connections formed support networks, discussion groups, and digital spaces where individuals could speak openly without fear of disciplinary consequences. This feeling of connection gave a lot of former members a voice they never thought they would have. People who had never questioned how the movement worked were interested in their stories because they were told with honesty and feeling. The movement also used digital tools to improve how it communicated. Videos were made that showed members, leaders, and events from around the world. People made websites to gather information in one place. Digital platforms made it easier to send out instructions and news. These actions made people feel like they were part of something new and united, even if they were far apart. For many, these digital tools offered a connection to the movement that felt fresh and accessible. Even though the group used technology, they were still wary of the internet's lack of filters. Leaders were worried about false information and criticism. Elders told congregations to pay attention to official sources. Members were told many times to be careful with what they read online. But being careful alone couldn't stop the flow of information. Screens were a part of life. There were always phones nearby. And in this setting, ideas spread quickly and freely, which was a problem for a movement that relied on careful messaging and tightly coordinated communication. The digital age made the organization more vulnerable in a way that letters and announcements alone couldn't fix. Once, leaders had a lot of power, but now that power is spread out among many people on the internet. Every member with a question held a device capable of offering answers from far outside the congregation's walls. This change didn't cause a lot of chaos, but it did put a steady, constant pressure on the edges of church life. As the digital world got louder, the movement had to change, readjust, and stress loyalty in ways that showed how they were dealing with this new problem. People kept going to meetings, volunteering, and serving in ministry, but they were always aware that they could see other points of view on a screen. This knowledge didn't break up the movement, but it did add a new level of tension that was quiet, constant, and hard to ignore. Over time, this tension would mix with other stresses, like historical expectations, internal discipline, and international challenges, to create a moment when the movement was at a crossroads. A time when faith, tradition, authority, and modern reality all came together in a way that couldn't be quickly or easily fixed. And it was in this growing mix of pressures that the next part of the story started to happen. The digital world changed how information flowed, and global pressures kept rising. Something began to change inside the movement. At first, it was quiet, but then it became heavy enough to be felt even in the most normal moments. Prayers still opened meetings. Families still came early to get their usual seats. People still went door to door with literature. At first glance, not much seemed to have changed. The routines that had shaped life in the movement for generations stayed the same. But the ground was moving under these routines. People who had once been completely sure about their faith now approached it with a mix of devotion and self-reflection. It wasn't rebellion or defiance. It was something much softer, an awareness that the world around them was changing faster than the things they depended on. Some of these changes made me feel better. Some made me feel uneasy in a quiet way. People felt that it was getting harder to keep the balance between old and new ways of life. People who never talked about these feelings still noticed the small changes in the air. Elders in many congregations noticed that people were being more careful about what they said. People who used to ask questions without thinking now hesitated, not sure how their curiosity would be seen. Young people who grew up in a world where information was always just a few taps away knew that their elders were dealing with problems that didn't exist in previous generations. They went to meetings and helped with ministry, but they still felt like they were part of the outside world in ways that older generations didn't get. Their thoughts went back and forth between two worlds, one shaped by tradition and the other by digital reality. In this changing world, the expectations placed on members were more important. The advice from headquarters stayed the same, with the same tone and structure. But world that got that advice had changed. Members worked in different places, went to universities where they could get information easily, and lived in societies where people were encouraged to express themselves. Some people were able to stick to rules that had been made long before these modern times, while others found it hard to do so without making a fuss. Families often changed in ways that showed how this new tension affected them. Parents tried to keep their kids away from things they thought were spiritually dangerous, while kids tried to figure out how to deal with friends, school rules, and online interactions that their parents had never had to deal with. These differences didn't always lead to fights, but they did make people wonder. A teen might be curious about why some ideas weren't allowed. A parent might be worried that their child could end up on a path they don't fully understand if they look for answers online. These worries didn't often turn into open fights, but they were always there in the background of everyday life. Elders also felt the pressure. They still wanted to lead their congregations with honesty, but they had to deal with problems that older generations of elders had never had to deal with. They answered questions that were influenced by new technology, complicated social problems, and cultural changes that were happening outside of the Kingdom Hall. Letters from headquarters gave instructions, but using those instructions in different situations required judgment, sensitivity, and sometimes a level of emotional strength that few people expected when they first took on their roles. The movement's global leaders kept shaping the faith's direction with a confidence that had defined their role for decades. But even at the top, they knew that things were getting worse. The way information was given out was changed. Some printed materials were replaced by digital videos. They made broadcasts to bring people together. International campaigns put a lot of stress on having a common identity. These efforts were meant to make people feel more connected at a time when the outside world seemed less stable. But unity also put a strain on things. As the organization stressed loyalty and consistency more, some members felt that flexibility had become less possible. Even when they were honest, there wasn't much room for different points of view. This understanding did not invariably result in conflict. More often than not, it led to silence, a silence full of thought, confusion, or quiet acceptance. Members loved their spiritual community, but they also knew that asking certain questions could have bad effects. For a lot of people, the crossroads came about slowly. They kept going to meetings, volunteering, and doing ministry work. But they also had questions that didn't fit into the structure they trusted to help them. There were times when these questions weren't about doctrine. They were sometimes about growing as a person, about relationships, about life in the modern world, and about the line between spiritual responsibility and personal understanding. Some members figured out how to combine their personal beliefs with their spiritual identity. Some people felt like they were at a quiet crossroads and didn't know what to do next. Even with these changes inside, the movement stayed strong in many places. People who believed deeply in the message they shared filled the congregations. Volunteers kept going to far-off places to tell more people about the faith. Families found comfort in routines that had worked for their ancestors. Even among the most dedicated, though, there was still a sense that the world around them was changing too quickly for the organization to keep up. In some families, older people looked at younger ones and felt a difference they couldn't quite put into words. The younger ones grew up with easy access to information and a worldview shaped by faith, as well as by technology, culture, and open discussion. They were honest, dedicated, and often very committed to their beliefs, but they lived their lives in a different way than their parents and grandparents. They asked questions because they lived in a world full of choices, connections, and points of view that previous generations had never seen. There was no obvious conflict during this generational shift, but there was a quiet split. The movement's teachings stressed being clear and sure. The modern world put a lot of value on exploring and expressing yourself. Members tried to find a middle ground between these two forces, but it was hard to keep things in balance, and over time, it became harder and harder. As these pressures came together, changing culture, digital access, family dynamics, internal expectations, and global attention, the movement found itself at a point that felt new and different from anything that had happened before. Not a crisis or a breakdown, but a time to think deeply. A time when the weight of history met the unknown present. A moment when both the leaders and the members knew that the future would not be the same as the past. This was the story's most fragile moment, at this quiet turning point where belief, authority, and modern reality all came together. A time when the movement's future seemed open, with both hope and doubt. And from this point, the documentary moves on to its last chapter, which ties together all the threads that have been woven through the lives of prophets, presidents, and the powerful people who shaped a global faith. The story that started in a small room above a store with handwritten notes and quiet talks has now spread to many countries and changed millions of lives. What began as a quest for understanding grew into a global movement, fueled by prophetic ideas, strong leadership, and a complex system of organization and power. The movement changed in ways that its first members could never have imagined. It grew over decades, had to deal with pushback from around the world, and had to adapt to the rise of a digital age that challenged old boundaries. And now, at the end of this long journey, the question that has been there the whole time becomes clear, not as an accusation or a verdict, but as a real look at power, belief, and the human experience. This movement, which is based on unity and conviction, has a story that spans 3 different times. People who wanted to find meaning in Scripture with open pages and restless hearts lived in the early era. Russell and his friends entered that time with good intentions, thinking they were finding truths that were right in front of them. Their ideas didn't just make a doctrine, they made a story, a way of looking at the world that made things clearer when things were unclear. The story felt real, important, and full of meaning for those who joined them. The next era came about because there was a need to keep order among a growing number of believers. The movement needed structure as more and more people joined and the message spread. Presidents came forward and put in place systems that made the organization stronger but also changed its identity. There was a centralization of decisions. Leadership became a part of the system. The movement started to act less like a group of people looking for something and more like a well-organized body that could reach people all over the world. And then came the modern age, which was ruled by the governing body and the hidden power brokers who helped it. The organization became a well-oiled global network under their leadership. Every sermon, every publication, and every policy showed that there was a central authority that millions of people followed. This structure brought people together, but it also put pressure on them. People who didn't know each other very well set expectations that members had to follow in their daily lives. Elders had duties that were shaped by hands that weren't visible. Families had rules that affected very private areas of their lives. For a lot of people, these expectations turned into signs of love. For some, they made a quiet tension that settled into the corners of everyday life. Every time period had its own strengths and problems. The first teachings gave people hope, but they tied that hope to certain times in the future that didn't happen as expected. The time of strong presidents brought stability, but it also caused fights over who was in charge. The modern era brought people together, but it also made the gap between members and the leaders who shaped their lives even bigger. None of these periods fully describe the movement. They show how belief changes when it goes from a small group of people looking for answers to a global organization. The world outside also changed over the years. Governments looked into how the organization worked. The courts looked closely at its rules. Human rights groups raised questions. Expectations in culture changed. Technology created new ways for people to talk to each other that no leader could completely control. And through all of this, members navigated the space between their spiritual identities and the world around them, trying to maintain balance in a landscape that often felt unfamiliar. The organization's evolution is not simply a matter of leadership shifts or doctrinal adjustments. It is a story of people, ordinary individuals who shaped their lives around faith, who sacrificed, who believed, who questioned, who stayed, who left, who loved their communities deeply, and who faced moments of uncertainty with sincerity. The experiences of these people are just as important to the movement as the choices made in offices far away from where they live. Members of every congregation, no matter where they are from, what language they speak, or how old they are, have quietly worked to move this movement forward. They have walked for miles in the heat and cold to spread their message. They have put together halls brick by brick. They have raised kids in a way that has shaped their own lives. They have helped each other through sickness, loss, and hard times. And they did all of this because they believed it was important, not just for themselves, but also for the people they loved. At the same time, many have had to deal with hard consequences, such as being cut off from loved ones, giving up their education or career, going through deep internal conflict, or having to stay silent when it felt impossible to speak up. These truths are next to the movement's successes. They don't cancel each other out. They show how complicated it is to have a faith that is not just written down but also lived by real people. The outside world is still changing, and it's happening faster than ever. Technology changes the way people talk. Cultures come together. People in societies question old ways of doing things. It's easy for new ideas to cross borders. And in this world that is always changing, the movement is at a point where it needs to decide what to do next. The organization doesn't lack direction. The world it works in has changed since it was built. Will the movement change to fit the fact that we live in a digital age where questions can't be contained and information flows freely? Will the structure at the top change in ways that take into account the experiences of members who are living in the modern world with new expectations? Will the conflict between authority and individuality become less intense, more intense, or change into something else entirely? These questions are still open, and maybe they should stay open, because leaders can't tell the whole story of a faith. Millions of people carry it with them and tell it through small acts of devotion, private doubts, family traditions, times of joy and struggle, and the choices they make when no one is looking. This documentary has followed the rise of a movement that was shaped by prophets, strengthened by presidents, and guided by powerful people whose influence goes far beyond what the public can see. It has looked into the systems, the problems, the growth, the arguments, and the stress that make up its complicated identity. But the last understanding does not come from authority, institutions, or predictions. It comes down to a simple question that everyone who has been affected by this story should ask. In a faith, who has the most power? The leaders who set its course, or the followers who live it every day? The world is always changing, and the movement is at a crossroads. The answer to that question could have a bigger impact on its future than any prediction, policy, or proclamation ever could. What if a quiet religious movement, known simply for knocking on doors, was itself being shaken from within? What if the world's most structured Christian denomination was facing a slow, silent struggle that had nothing to do with governments or outside critics, but everything to do with its own rise in global authority? On the surface, Jehovah's Witnesses appear gentle, steady, predictable. You notice them walking in pairs through calm neighborhoods, dressed neatly, greeting strangers with polite smiles. Their conversations carry no urgency, no noise, no alarm, just a steady message they've repeated for decades. But behind this soft exterior lies an intricate machine, one that stretches across continents. It reaches into remote villages, crowded cities, isolated islands, and towering financial districts. It is a movement built on order, discipline, and control so effective that outsiders often underestimate the structure shaping it from within. Inside kingdom halls, families settle into silence as meetings begin. There is a sense of routine here, words spoken in a familiar rhythm, lessons repeated with unwavering precision. Nothing feels out of place. And yet, if you spent long enough observing, you might catch subtle hints that something deeper is stirring. An older member pausing longer than usual before answering a question. A whisper between two elders that carries more tension than the polite tone suggests. A sudden change in an announcement. A rule presented with sharper certainty. These tiny signals, barely noticeable, are like cracks forming in a polished stone. Not enough to break it, not enough to draw attention, but enough to raise quiet questions in the minds of those who stand close enough to feel the shift. Behind this calm public image stands a vast administrative tower, figuratively and literally. At its center is the organization's headquarters in New York, a building that feels more like the nerve center of a multinational body than a simple religious office. From these upper floors, decisions ripple outward into every congregation on earth. Policies crafted in secluded rooms shape the lives of millions. Instructions written by unseen committees reach elders who deliver them without alteration. For a faith built on the idea of spiritual equality, this level of central control creates a pressure that is rarely discussed openly. Yet this is not a new phenomenon. The struggle between spiritual ideals and organizational authority has existed since the earliest days of this movement. Over time, leadership styles changed, teaching methods shifted, and the faces at the top rotated. But the underlying question, who truly guides the direction of this faith, never entirely faded. It simply moved from one era to the next, resting in the hands of different figures, prophetic voices, presidential rulers, and eventually invisible operators who influence the structure from behind locked doors. Today, that tug-of-war has reached its most complex stage. On one side stands a growing leadership structure, firm, coordinated, international. On the other side stand members across the globe whose expectations remain tied to the early story, a small group of Bible students seeking clarity, truth, and the promise of a better world. As global authority expands, the space between those two worlds becomes harder to ignore. Many members feel this tension without being able to name it. They sense the shift in tone, the tightening of rules, the steady rise in formality. Instructional videos replace open discussions. Elder letters arrive more frequently. Meetings focus heavily on loyalty. Questions that once felt harmless now carry weight. A quiet expectation grows. Obey instantly, trust fully, speak cautiously. Because behind every rule stands a chain of command that reaches far beyond the walls of a local hall. This structure has grown so large that it almost resembles a small nation, one without borders, armies, or elections, yet with clear leadership and enforced loyalty. It moves slowly, confidently, always projecting steadiness. But even the most stable system can feel pressure when its power becomes too concentrated or when its narrative stretches beyond what members can hold without strain. Imagine standing inside a crowded kingdom hall. The opening prayer has ended, and an elder steps onto the stage. His tone is gentle, but behind his words is a firm message from far above him. He speaks not only as a local figure, but also as a conduit for a much larger mind. Each phrase he delivers is shaped by someone he has never met. Each instruction he shares originated from a distant table where a small group decided what millions should believe, how they should behave, and what choices they should avoid. Some accept this without question. Others feel something tightening around them, like a rope being pulled from both ends. They understand the importance of unity, yet they notice how unity is slowly changing into uniformity. And when uniformity becomes the expectation, the slightest difference begins to feel dangerous. This documentary begins at this crossroads, where faith meets authority, where belief meets control, and where devotion meets the slow rise of institutional power. Here, three forces stand at the heart of the tension. Prophets, the early voices whose interpretations shaped the foundation. Presidents, the men who turned a small study group into a global structure. Power brokers, modern figures whose influence is vast yet largely unseen. Together, these forces form a triad that defines the story of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Their teachings are not shaped by a single mind but by the layered impact of these eras, prophetic beginnings, presidential authority, and the current expansion of global leadership. But to understand how this pressure formed, we cannot begin with today's leaders. We must return to a time before the global offices, before the legal departments, before the carefully crafted broadcasts. We must step backward into the world of a young man searching for answers, a man whose questions quietly planted the seeds of a movement that would one day circle the earth. And so, before the machinery of leadership existed, before the structure hardened into what it is now, there stood a single figure, an idealist, a seeker, a voice that believed certainty could be found in ancient texts. His story begins not in a boardroom but in a simple room above a shop, surrounded by worn books and flickering lamps, where a small group gathered with open pages and restless minds. The story goes back to the late 1800s, when factories were the most common thing on the skyline and horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with the first streetcars. The United States was growing quickly, but with that growth came uncertainty. People were doubting everything: their faith, their money, their future, and their place in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. There was a young man named Charles Taze Russell walking through this restless landscape. He was carrying doubts that he tried to hide behind calm eyes. He grew up in a place where people talked about religious ideas with complete confidence, but those ideas never really fit with him. Every sermon he heard made him ask more questions than it answered, and every warning about eternal punishment made something in his chest tighten that he couldn't ignore. Russell walked around bookstores looking for clues, flipping through old books on theology, history, and biblical commentary. He heard pastors argue with each other in crowded halls where the air smelled like sweat and smoke. He got more and more confused the more he listened. Even though the preachers around him spoke loudly and with confidence, nothing felt real. He was afraid of getting stuck in beliefs that didn't match what he read on his own. He wondered if he was looking for answers that weren't there, but something deeper kept him going. His search wasn't driven by rebellion. It was driven by a need to understand a God he thought had to be more consistent than the versions he heard preached from pulpits. One night, after leaving a sermon that was too strict for his taste, Russell was drawn to a small group inside a small building that was talking about the Bible. There were open books and handwritten notes all over the wooden table in the warm room. The conversation was gentle compared to the heated debates he had heard elsewhere. They were asking questions not to be rude, but to learn. He joined them reluctantly, expecting them to fight back, but instead he found that they were interested. He felt, what if a quiet religious movement, known simply for knocking on doors, was itself being shaken from within? What if the world's most structured Christian denomination was facing a slow, silent struggle that had nothing to do with governments or outside critics, but everything to do with its own rise in global authority? On the surface, Jehovah's Witnesses appear gentle, steady, predictable. You notice them walking in pairs through calm neighborhoods, dressed neatly, greeting strangers with polite smiles. Their conversations carry no urgency, no noise, no alarm, just a steady message they've repeated for decades. But behind this soft exterior lies an intricate machine, one that stretches across continents. It reaches into remote villages, crowded cities, isolated islands, and towering financial districts. It is a movement built on order, discipline, and control so effective that outsiders often underestimate the structure shaping it from within. Inside kingdom halls, families settle into silence as meetings begin. There is a sense of routine here, words spoken in a familiar rhythm, lessons repeated with unwavering precision. Nothing feels out of place. And yet, if you spent long enough observing, you might catch subtle hints that something deeper is stirring. An older member pausing longer than usual before answering a question. A whisper between two elders that carries more tension than the polite tone suggests. A sudden change in an announcement. A rule presented with sharper certainty. These tiny signals, barely noticeable, are like cracks forming in a polished stone. Not enough to break it, not enough to draw attention, but enough to raise quiet questions in the minds of those who stand close enough to feel the shift. Behind this calm public image stands a vast administrative tower, figuratively and literally. At its center is the organization's headquarters in New York, a building that feels more like the nerve center of a multinational body than a simple religious office. From these upper floors, decisions ripple outward into every congregation on earth. Policies crafted in secluded rooms shape the lives of millions. Instructions written by unseen committees reach elders who deliver them without alteration. For a faith built on the idea of spiritual equality, this level of central control creates a pressure that is rarely discussed openly. Yet this is not a new phenomenon. The struggle between spiritual ideals and organizational authority has existed since the earliest days of this movement. Over time, leadership styles changed, teaching methods shifted, and the faces at the top rotated. But the underlying question, who truly guides the direction of this faith, never entirely faded. It simply moved from one era to the next, resting in the hands of different figures, prophetic voices, presidential rulers, and eventually, invisible operators who influence the structure from behind locked doors. Today, that tug-of-war has reached its most complex stage. On one side stands a growing leadership structure, firm, coordinated, international. On the other side stand members across the globe whose expectations remain tied to the early story, a small group of Bible students seeking clarity, truth, and the promise of a better world. As global authority expands, the space between those two worlds becomes harder to ignore. Many members feel this tension without being able to name it. They sense the shift in tone, the tightening of rules, the steady rise in formality. Instructional videos replace open discussions. Elder letters arrive more frequently. Meetings focus heavily on loyalty. Questions that once felt harmless now carry weight. A quiet expectation grows. Obey instantly, trust fully, speak cautiously. Because behind every rule stands a chain of command that reaches far beyond the walls of a local hall. This structure has grown so large that it almost resembles a small nation, one without borders, armies, or elections, yet with clear leadership and enforced loyalty. It moves slowly, confidently, always projecting steadiness. But even the most stable system can feel pressure when its power becomes too concentrated or when its narrative stretches beyond what members can hold without strain. Imagine standing inside a crowded kingdom hall. The opening prayer has ended, and an elder steps onto the stage. His tone is gentle, but behind his words is a firm message from far above him. He speaks not only as a local figure, but also as a conduit for a much larger mind. Each phrase he delivers is shaped by someone he has never met. Each instruction he shares originated from a distant table where a small group decided what millions should believe, how they should behave, and what choices they should avoid. Some accept this without question. Others feel something tightening around them, like a rope being pulled from both ends. They understand the importance of unity, yet they notice how unity is slowly changing into uniformity. And when uniformity becomes the expectation, the slightest difference begins to feel dangerous. This documentary begins at this crossroads, where faith meets authority, where belief meets control, and where devotion meets the slow rise of institutional power. Here, three forces stand at the heart of the tension. Prophets, the early voices whose interpretations shaped the foundation. Presidents, the men who turned a small study group into a global structure. Power brokers, modern figures whose influence is vast yet largely unseen. Together, these forces form a triad that defines the story of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Their teachings are not shaped by a single mind but by the layered impact of these eras, prophetic beginnings, presidential authority, and the current expansion of global leadership. But to understand how this pressure formed, we cannot begin with today's leaders. We must return to a time before the global offices, before the legal departments, before the carefully crafted broadcasts. We must step backward into the world of a young man searching for answers, a man whose questions quietly planted the seeds of a movement that would one day circle the earth. And so, before the machinery of leadership existed, before the structure hardened into what it is now, there stood a single figure, an idealist, a seeker, a voice that believed certainty could be found in ancient texts. His story begins not in a boardroom but in a simple room above a shop, surrounded by worn books and flickering lamps, where a small group gathered with open pages and restless minds. The story goes back to the late 1800s, when factories were the most common thing on the skyline and horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with the first streetcars. The United States was growing quickly, but with that growth came uncertainty. People were doubting everything: their faith, their money, their future, and their place in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. There was a young man named Charles Taze Russell walking through this restless landscape. He was carrying doubts that he tried to hide behind calm eyes. He grew up in a place where people talked about religious ideas with complete confidence, but those ideas never really fit with him. Every sermon he heard made him ask more questions than it answered, and every warning about eternal punishment made something in his chest tighten that he couldn't ignore. Russell walked around bookstores looking for clues, flipping through old books on theology, history, and biblical commentary. He heard pastors argue with each other in crowded halls where the air smelled like sweat and smoke. He got more and more confused the more he listened. Even though the preachers around him spoke loudly and with confidence, nothing felt real. He was afraid of getting stuck in beliefs that didn't match what he read on his own. He wondered if he was looking for answers that weren't there, but something deeper kept him going. His search wasn't driven by rebellion. It was driven by a need to understand a God he thought had to be more consistent than the versions he heard preached from pulpits.